By day 3, you're starting to hallucinate from the lack of sleep. It's a pretty miserable experience. Everything in me wanted to go to sleep, but I knew that if I went to sleep, I'd never wake up. Hey, you push through this. You have the ability to keep going. An overcome mindset is never built in comfort. It is only built in discomfort. Listen to me. People will follow you if you give them a reason to. He said that's all leadership is. And I turned to try and move back to where our guys were, and I caught a round in the face. It hit me right in front of the ear, traveled through my face, took off my nose.
First of all, this is my voice. I'm Tim Green, and I have ALS. This podcast is not about ALS or living with disabilities. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for me. I am a father of 5 with a marriage that's lasted for over 33 years. I am a #1 New York Times best-selling author of 41 books, an NFL first-round pick with an 8-year career. I worked on TV for Fox Sports, Good Morning America, Court TV, and Extra. I've hosted BattleBots, A Current Affair, and Find My Family. And I am also a practicing attorney. In this podcast, we're diving into real-life stories. From triumphs to trials, we'll explore the extraordinary in the ordinary. Join me, Tim Green, and my son Troy each week for real conversations, laughter, and insights. Because life is a journey, and everyone's got a story. My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Jason Redman, you were an officer with the elite Navy SEALs, and you are a true hero. You were awarded both the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star for combat valor. You are also a best-selling author of 3 books, a motivational speaker, a speaking coach, an entrepreneur, a husband, and a father of 3. It's such an honor to have you on our podcast. Thank you for being here.
Tim, my honor. Thank you for having me, man. Definitely. I'm always inspired by fellow overcomers.
You have a proud family history of patriotic service. Please tell us about it.
Yeah, I grew up in just a very patriotic family. Originally from Ohio. I was talking to your son about this earlier. Raised a Browns fan and a Buckeye fan, and we were a big football family, but also a big military family. I was raised with the stories of my both grandfathers fought in World War II. And my dad's father was a very decorated World War II B-24 bomber pilot flying over the European theater, flew all of his missions, which was, a lot of pilots didn't make it. They had to fly a minimum of 25 missions, and he flew all of his missions. He was shot down over Yugoslavia. It was during the winter, and they crash landed into a snow-covered field, and everybody survived, and they evaded back to Italy. And he got the Distinguished Flying Cross for that, and 7 air medals. So these were stories I grew up hearing about. My great uncle, my grandfather's brother, was also a pilot, and he flew in the Pacific Theater and was shot down and killed. And then on my mother's side, my mother's side of the family is French, and that grandfather fought with the French in World War II. And then they immigrated over to Canada. So I just grew up with these stories. My dad joined the Army and was an Army officer, an airborne instructor, and a rigger, a parachute rigger during the Vietnam War. Didn't go to Vietnam, but served during that time. And I just grew up with this patriotism and belief in service. And from a young age, it's all I ever wanted to do. I originally wanted to be a pilot like my grandfather. I mean, I was born in 75, and Top Gun came out in whatever year. I think I was 11, maybe 85 or 86 is when Top Gun came out. I was like, yes, I want to be Maverick. And then as I got a little older, my dad having been in the Army and jumping out of planes, I started learning about special operations, and that really piqued my interest. I was interested in the Green Berets and the Rangers. And then my dad told me about the Navy SEAL teams, and there wasn't a whole lot of information about them back then. But as I started to research and I could find a little, it just really piqued my interest. I was like, that's what I want to do. So at about the age of 14, I decided that's what I wanted to do. I wasn't a big athlete back then. I was kind of a late bloomer, but I decided if I was going to become a SEAL, I had to get tough. So I went out for the football team and never was that great, but I enjoyed it and got my ass kicked a lot, which taught me a lot. And then I started wrestling, and that led me down the path where when I was 17, still in high school, I enlisted in the Navy in a program called the Delayed Entry Program, where you're still in high school, but you join. And I actually joined on September 11th, 1992 was the day I joined the Navy, and graduated high school. And as soon as I was done, I headed to boot camp in the summer of 1993.
Given that you had your mindset on the service, do you think that was any kind of disincentive to perform academically?
No, not at all. Because as a matter of fact, I knew, an interesting thing, and I talked to a lot of young men about the SEAL teams. I'll meet young men who say, "I want to be a SEAL," and they focus a ton on their athletic abilities. And I ask them, I'm like, "How are your grades?" And some of them not that great. And I'm like, "Listen, you have to have good grades. You have to be smart." That's a lot of things people don't realize. Our special operations forces, not only are they athletically tough, they're mentally very smart. And I knew that. I understood that. So I also knew if I got in trouble, it would throw off my plans. Um, and I was a little bit of a rebellious as I got older, but thankfully wanting to go in the Navy and knowing that if I got in any real trouble, it would jeopardize my security clearance. So all those things kept me out of trouble. And Troy, in answer to your question, no, my parents really supported it. Both of them felt like, hey, this is a good path for you.
Did you have other interests in high school, or was it only the military?
Girls. That was probably about it. I wasn't, I enjoyed team sports. I really enjoyed football. I wish I had found football when I was younger. But like I said, I blossomed late. I didn't probably, I was the proverbial runt. When I was 16, I was probably still only about 5 feet tall and maybe 95 pounds. So imagine this little runt going around telling everybody he's going to be a Navy SEAL. I mean, people used to laugh me out of the recruiting office laughed me out of the office. When I started wrestling, I wrestled originally 112, and then I went to 119, which our 119 pounder was our state champion in North Carolina. I was living in North Carolina then, and he used to just kick my ass. But the reality was that was actually a good thing because it taught me a lot about um, getting beat and still pushing yourself and still pushing against adversity and still showing up, which is a lot of what the SEAL teams are about. So those things were good. Other than that, I didn't have a whole lot of that. My focus was on being a SEAL. That's what I focused. Once I locked onto that, that's all I wanted to do. And I kind of studied that and I trained. I worked out. And I went to school all with this goal of, hey, you're on the path and this is where you're going. Don't mess it up. Don't get yourself in trouble and don't get off course. Because, once I was 17 in high school, I joined. I was on that pipeline. I knew I was going to boot camp. And in boot camp, I had the opportunity to screen for SEAL training. I had to pick up a SEAL slot by successfully completing the SEAL qualification test. And from there, everything was laid out and I was following that plan.
What made you determined to be specifically a Navy SEAL?
When my dad told me about them, so a lot of people don't know, up until 2001, the Army controlled everything air operations related when it not jets and things like that. That's obviously Air Force, but any parachute activities, the Army controlled. So if anybody wanted to go through any kind of parachuting training, they had to go through the Army program under the Department of Defense, which meant SEALs went through airborne school up until 2001. After 2001, because of the war, everything changed, and the SEAL teams created their own airborne school, and we have our own free fall program now. But SEALs went through airborne school with my dad. So when he was telling me about special operations, he said, hey, there's a group of guys that not a whole lot of people know about. They're called Navy SEALs. I was a pretty good swimmer. When my parents divorced, my mom moved down to the Virgin Islands. So I was big into bodyboarding and being in the surf and in the water, and was just very comfortable in the water. I was a strong swimmer. I didn't swim competitively, but I was just a strong swimmer from that. And my dad said, you should look into this. These guys, they say that their training is the toughest in the entire military. And I don't know what it was about that, but it was that phrase right there, toughest in the entire military. Here I was, this little runt, and something clicked in me, and I was like, that's what I want to do. So that once I found out about that, I never wanted to do anything else. I remember going into the recruiting office, and they had an old video called Be Someone Special. And it was this super grainy 1980s, poorly produced, but I'll never forget it, man. And there's a lot of other SEALs out there that'll talk about this video too, who grew up in my generation. And these old, it looks like Magnum PI style guys with the big mustaches and, the hair, and they fly in on a helicopter and they take down some target. And and I was just like, that's what I want to do. So never really lost sight of that. Just started training and to go down that path.
How and when did you meet your wife with all of this going on?
So I met my wife years later. I'd been a SEAL for about 8 years when I met my wife. So which was kind of nice. I kind of got to explore the world and grow up and sow my oats a little bit. My first SEAL team, I went to a team that focused on Central and South America. So I learned Spanish and was actually pretty fluent in Spanish and spent a lot of time in Central and South America. And after I had done some of those operational tours, I became a training instructor at the SEAL teams, not out at the actual SEAL training in California. So a lot of people get that confused. We have guys who have some experience and they train actual SEALs. And then you have SEALs that go out to California and they train our new guys who are becoming SEALs. So I was a SEAL instructor at our SEAL team, teaching communications, reconnaissance, marksmanship, and stuff. And we were training in Fort Knox, Kentucky, and which is close to Louisville, Kentucky. And went into Louisville one weekend to a large bar, all of us young men on the hunt. And in walked this beautiful blonde, all bronze. She had just come back from Florida for a week. So she had, very tan and, beautiful smile. And I saw her and I was like, I need to meet that gal. And went up to her and she promptly shot me down. And so I licked my wounds and went back to my buddies and drank a couple more bottles of liquid courage. And later in the night, I saw her upstairs and let me rephrase. I was going to say she was talking to some guy, but I should say some guy was talking to her and she looked very uncomfortable. And I was like, man, I'm going to go save this damsel in distress.
Time to shine.
Yeah. So I jumped in there and chased that guy away. And from that point, we hit it off and started dating. Kind of had a long distance relationship for about 1.5 years and then got married.
What do you remember as the most difficult part of your training?
That's a good question. When you go through, basic SEAL training, which every young Navy member who wants to be a SEAL go through, it's called Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. And the hardest block of that training is Hell Week. Hell Week is notorious around the world for how difficult it is. It lasts a week. And during that week, you only get about 3 hours of sleep at most. You're constantly wet, coated in sand. You chafe holes in your body. By day 3, you're starting to hallucinate from the lack of sleep. It's a pretty miserable experience. And the majority of candidates quit during Hell Week. 80% of the class, typically on average, will quit during Hell Week. And that was incredibly difficult. Often the instructors would say, hey, you're going to be colder and wetter and more miserable when you get into the SEAL teams. And when you hear that, you just think, you're full of it. There's no way. This will be the worst it'll ever be. But in some ways, they were right. It didn't last quite as long, but there were moments of time in training. I remember one night, I was now a SEAL and in a platoon. And I remember one night we did what we call a helocast operation on the northern side of the Chesapeake Bay. And then we called out an OTB, an over the beach operation, where we were going to do a close quarters combat scenario, taking down a target. And a storm rolled in. When we left, it was like 65 degrees, and the forecast was supposed to kind of stay that way. It wasn't supposed to get very cold. It wasn't supposed to be bad. And this storm rolled in, and none of us were prepared for it. None of us were dressed for cold weather conditions. And the temperature plummeted down into the 40s. And we had to do this, 20-mile navigation across the Chesapeake, wet, cold. I mean, I want to say it was probably one of the more cold times I've ever felt. I'll never forget when we finally got to the beach and came across the beach. My hands were so numb. I was literally, it was like I couldn't even get my fingers to work. So I'm kind of cradling my gun and trying to maneuver my safety with like these almost like flippers. My fingers didn't even work, but you still had to execute. You still had to do what we were doing. So a big lesson learned for me. That was a pretty difficult night, and there were frequently many things like that in training where you were just brutally cold, or you were having to continue to push yourself further and further. And then, I mean, the night that I was wounded was definitely a night where I had to dig deep, and I mean, everything in me wanted to go to sleep. But I knew that if I went to sleep, I'd never wake up again. And I've often had other teammates and friends who have been in pretty big gunfights who said, man, going back to SEAL training and Hell Week enabled them to have the mindset to keep going and keep pushing.
So you felt like the training was easier than actually being a SEAL, or do you think the training was, kind of did get you ready for that extreme adversity?
I think it got me ready. I wouldn't say that there were times as a SEAL that I felt Hell Week was harder. I mean, Hell Week's definitely probably the top hardest thing I've ever been through in my life, but I've been through other hard things. Ranger school was difficult. In 2010, I climbed Mount Rainier and I got sick, and we climbed in honor of a teammate who had died. And I had an upper respiratory infection that apparently, unbeknownst to me, had already manifested into bronchitis. By the time we were up at altitude, I was hacking up big chunks of green nastiness. And unbeknownst to us, I mean, it was so bad, and I guess the altitude made it worse. Like the right side of my lung was starting to collapse. And the guides were like, you have to go down. And I was like, screw you. I am going to the top of this mountain in honor of our guy that was, who died, Ryan Job. And I'll be honest, it's one of the, I'd say it's the top 3. It's the third hardest thing I've ever had to do, because I just had to go back into just put one foot in front of the other. And if I die on the next step, I'm going to die on the next step. But and thankfully I didn't. But Yeah, that's probably, but it was that training that enabled me to do that. And I think in many of the hard situations in our life, it was the training and going through those things. I try to tell people, I often talk about building an overcome mindset. Um, you can't build it out of an entire life of comfort. You have to have gone through some hard times so that your mind can go back to those hard times and remind yourself, hey, you pushed through this. You have the ability to keep going. An overcome mindset is never built in comfort. It is only built in discomfort.
I got to ask you this too, because every time, I don't know anything about it, never did anything in the military. I can't imagine Hell Week. But every time I see people talking about this, it turns into a debate of which Hell Week is worse, winter or summer. So I got to ask where you're at, where you fall on that.
Winter Hell Week is worse. I went through a winter Hell Week. But the waters out in the Pacific are cold no matter what. I mean, if you've ever gotten into the waters in the Pacific in the middle, in the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf Stream warms everything up. So I mean, the water, in the middle of the summer and off the East Coast, I mean, it can be in the 80 degrees. On the West Coast, it never gives much above, maybe at the warmest, it may be 64, 65, which is pretty cold. I mean, in the winter, it gets down into the 50s. So because of that, the instructors know we have timetables. We know whatever the water temperature is, here's how long we can keep guys in the water to get them right on the verge of hypothermia. And then you continue to play that game. So, it's very scientific. That we follow tables, we follow calculations. We have medical staff who are there monitoring everything. So everybody gets pushed past their breaking point in SEAL training. That is the purpose, because we want to see what happens when somebody goes past their breaking point. Do they break and quit, or do they keep going? And we're looking obviously for the guys who are able to break and keep going.
Is there a moment, you said about 80% quit in Hell Week. Is there a specific training or drill that you guys do? Like, is it the water? Is it what is the thing? Is there a thing that breaks the most amount of people?
Cold is what breaks the majority of people. I mean, you're cold, wet, and coated in sand. So it's a combination of cold and discomfort. But they have an evolution called surf torture. Apparently, the Navy, we're not allowed to use that. Apparently that's not politically correct to use that anymore. So it's now called water immersion therapy. But they take you down to the surf zone. They march you in a line, down to the surf zone. You march right up to where you're about, knee deep. And then they have everybody turn around and face back towards the beach. And then you sit down and lay down with your head back so the waves are crashing over your head. So you're getting water up your nose and sand up your nose. And you lay there for, as long as the tables say, which when you're that cold feels like eternity. So a lot of guys end up quitting. And you will do this all through Hell Week. Like, you'll go do an evolution, and then you'll go do water immersion therapy. You'll get out and think you're done, and you'll go back and do more water immersion therapy. You'll crawl across the beach, and you'll go do more water immersion therapy. If you're not doing water immersion therapy, you're carrying the boat on your head running all over the base. And that brings its own level of misery because, the boat's heavy. Your neck is hurting, your head is hurting. So when you're under the boat, you're wishing you could be back in the water. And when you're in the water, you're wishing you're back under the boat. So, I mean, Hell Week is appropriately named. But most people will quit because of the cold. You have a lot more quitters that happen during surf torture. And there are some other evolutions that really weed guys out. Another evolution called steel piers.
What's that one?
During steel piers, it's it happens usually on the second, almost 48 hours in. So you've now been awake for 48 hours. So you're mentally starting to break down, and physically you're exhausted. It's at night. Usually it's around midnight. They take you over to these large steel piers. They're about 100 by 50 feet, and they're made out of metal. They float. We use them to set them next to ships to do repairs and stuff like that. And they just have them next to the pier. And they have the whole class get on these steel piers, and you strip down to almost nothing, and they're misting the steel pier with fire hoses, and it'll last about 4 or 5 hours where you're laying on top of this pier, and you'll have to get up and do different exercises. They'll kick all your clothes into the water. You're jumping in and trying to find your clothes and your boots, and if you don't find something, the whole class gets punished. And you'll just do this evolution over and over again for hours. And that by far in my class, I mean, we lost 50% of the class during steel period.
Wow.
There's a lot of psychological warfare that happens during steel piers when a guy quit. The actual pier itself was up above, and the vehicles, the vans, were parked up there, and the steel piers were down below, right below that. So the vans were parked and they were left on. So when a student quit, the instructors would give them a blanket and a hot cup of coffee and send them up to sit in the van. So you'd see these guys sitting in the van drinking their hot coffee with a blanket while you're just getting your ass kicked, freezing to death. And I mean, there's a big, strong incentive to be like, what am I doing? Why am I such an idiot? These guys are the smart. I try to tell the young men that I often mentor, prepare yourself for those things. It's amazing though, when you're mentally compromised, like just exhausted and cold and wet and in pain, how easy it is to give in, to mentally give in. And just, somebody once said to me, the strongest human drive is comfort out of discomfort. Like when we're super uncomfortable or in pain, that is the strongest human drive we have. So to push against that, to continue to endure pain and discomfort by choice, because, in SEAL training, all you have to do is ring that bell. All you have to do is say, I quit. I don't want to do this anymore. And obviously 80% of people do.
What attributes do you think you displayed with the SEALs that made them single you out for officer training?
I think I was organized. I aspired to do it. I mean, that's part, that is a part of it. One, I think you have to have a desire to be an officer. Two, I had some individuals, my training officers, some others who saw aptitude for that. I was organized. I think I displayed some leadership qualities that led to that. Unfortunately, later, I also displayed some immature qualities that I probably needed to grow up a little bit, which I talk about in my book. But I think those were the things. I think I was halfway intelligent. I was able to be somewhat organized, and I was willing to step up and lead. And those things are obviously what we're looking for in our leaders in the SEAL teams, whether it's officers or our senior enlisted members.
Please tell us what happened in Afghanistan.
So I got Afghanistan in 2005. I was part of SEAL Team 10, and our troop was split. My platoon was in Germany. Our other platoon, Echo platoon, was in Afghanistan. And if you've read the book Lone Survivor or seen that movie, when the helicopter was shot down, that was our troop. So my boss was Eric Christensen, who was our senior officer who was killed when the helicopter was shot down. And I had several friends on that helicopter. So we launched from Germany, went to Afghanistan. There were the recovery ops. And I don't know, somewhat immature on my part as a leader. I think all of us wanted retribution for what happened. I think as a leader, you got to balance that with the mission and all these different things. there's a lot more to this story. It would take a long time, but the bottom line is, fast forward about 3 months, we had gone down to, and I even need to back up more. I This is where I talked about being an immature leader. Leading up to, before we even went to Afghanistan, when before we left the States, and even in Germany, I really enjoyed partying. I think I carried some of those traits as a young enlisted SEAL with me over as an officer. And even though I had a few people say, "Hey, you need to throttle that back," I didn't listen. And that damaged my credibility as a leader. And it's a lot of what I speak on. I talk a lot about this in my book, The Trident. I only say that because I'm prefacing it with, going into Afghanistan, I had already done some damage to my reputation as a leader. So now, fast forward to September of 2005, we had lost the guys from Red Wings. We're trying to make an impact. And we got into a gunfight on a mission in the southern province, the Helmand province of Afghanistan. I was in an overwatch position leading a team, and made the decision to take myself and a machine gunner down into the valley. My senior chief, who was operating in a leadership position with the ground force commander, basically said, "Don't go down into that valley." He and I did not like each other, kind of a strong personality conflict between the two of us. And instead of being mature and saying, "Hey, why should I not go into the valley?" I said, "Hey, screw you. I'm going." I didn't say this across radio, but in my mind, I said, "Hey, screw you. I'm going down to the valley to support these guys." It was a very bad call. He knew in that moment that we were trying to call in air support, air assets to try and support the guys down in the valley. And when I made the decision to go down in the valley with this machine gunner, it uh, it pro it prolonged the time to get the air assets in place, because now they didn't know where we were. We weren't in a known position. We were now on the move. So that created a lot of complexity. I'm very fortunate that it didn't lead to anybody being killed or even injured, because if it had, I think my story would be very different. I think I definitely would have been kicked out. But instead, by the time I got to the bottom of the valley, 30 minutes had passed, and they had us on the radio. They said, "Get your ass out of the valley. We're trying to bring in this airstrike." Got back out to the north side of the valley at this point. But and they were able to bring in the airstrike and make things happen. But in that sequence, I killed the rest of my professional reputation. Really killed my credibility. And many of the guys said, "Hey, Redman's dangerous. Get rid of him." So that kind of led me down a new path of having to grow up. I almost got myself kicked out, and I pushed against it for a while. I was kind of in denial about it. One of the things that happened is I got sent to U.S. Army Ranger School a few months later, after we got out of Afghanistan and got home. And Ranger School was really a great thing. At its heart and soul, Ranger School is a leadership school. A lot of people don't know this. I mean, it is very difficult. And there's a difference between Ranger School and saying, "Hey, I was a U.S. Army Ranger." That means they were attached to a Ranger battalion and were a Ranger, no different than a SEAL. But then there's Ranger School, which the Army uses as a advanced tactical leadership school. And it's why other services send frontline combat troops to Ranger School, which is what the SEAL teams and SEAL leadership did with me. So Ranger School, there's kind of more details to this story that we don't have time for today. But the bottom line is, it forced me to grow up, and I really needed it. It forced me to mature as a leader and to grow up and come to understand, A, I wasn't as great as I thought I was. And B, if you're going to be a leader, you have to be a leader. You can't pick and choose when you're going to be a leader. And I was fortunate that they gave me that opportunity. And I came back to the SEAL teams with a very different view. Had to build back my reputation, but did that. and before we headed to Iraq for our next deployment, which was very combat intensive.
Was there something at that Ranger school, that something specific that happened that made you kind of have that mental shift, or do you think it was just realizing what you could have lost? Or
Oh no, I quit Ranger school and about got kicked out. So I had a bad attitude when I showed up to Ranger school. I was, like I said, I was still kind of bitter and in denial about everything that happened. Like many of us, when something happens in our lives, if you don't own it and take full ownership, there's a natural tendency to place blame in other places. And that's what I was doing. I was blaming everybody else. I had the victim mindset. I had this mindset that I was just being thrown under the bus. So I showed up at Ranger school with a bad attitude, and B, with a poor misconception that Ranger school was going to be easy and I could just skip through it. And, hey man, I've been through SEAL training. I'm a combat veteran. Like this is going to be easy. And it wasn't. Ranger school is very hard. I don't think mentally I had done a good job of preparing myself for that. So, I failed the land navigation course on like day 3. And the Ranger instructor, I was the only SEAL in the class, and there's a natural animosity between SEALs and Rangers. We butt heads pretty good. So the Ranger instructors definitely gave me a lot of extra attention for being at Ranger school. So when I failed the land navigation course, they laid into me super hard, like, just pouring into me for being a failure. And, hey, you know, uh, hey, Swabby, would you have passed if you had a boat? Maybe if we gave you a sextant, you would have been able to navigate better. Hey, John Paul Jones, you know what I mean? Just all kinds of stuff. And I let a lot of frustration and anger build up. And I call this weak emotional leadership, where I blew up on those guys and they said, "Are you quitting?" And I said, "Yes." Spur of the moment decision. Only thing I've ever quit in my entire life. And when an officer quits Ranger school, they have to go before the Ranger, the commanding officer for Ranger school, who was a fantastic Ranger by the name of Colonel KK Chin. And I met with Colonel Chin and gave him the sob story, how I was being thrown under the bus, and this BS victim story. And Colonel Chin listened, and he said, "Hey, would you like to talk to anybody from the SEAL teams before you process out?" And I was like, "Not only no, but hell no." I'll be honest, I was super ashamed. I was super ashamed of what had happened. I was ashamed of myself. I didn't want to talk to any SEAL and admit to what had happened. And and Colonel Chin said, "Well, hey, I have a respected friend that's a SEAL leader. Why don't you talk to him?" And I was like, "I don't want to talk to anybody." But he was already dialing the phone, and he picked up the phone and, "Hey, what's going on?" And then he said, "Here, talk to Captain Vince Peterson." Captain Peterson is probably one of the most respected SEALs of my generation, and he was my former commanding officer. He got me commissioned, a legend in the SEAL teams, and like there was no way I could say no to that call. And I took the phone, and he said, "Red, what are you doing?" And I gave him this BS story, how I was being thrown under the bus, and he basically said, "Do you honestly think there's not an opportunity for you to learn and grow up here?" And I was like, maybe, but I said, the bottom line, I've messed up too much. It's too late to recover. I said, nobody will follow me again. And he said, "Red," he said, "listen to me. People will follow you if you give them a reason to." He said, "That's all leadership is." He said, "Go back to Ranger school, crush it, and come back to the SEAL teams and give the guys a reason to follow you." And that was kind of the defining moment for me. Although, I remember handing the phone back to the colonel and I said, "Okay, will you put me back in my class?" And he goes, "No, absolutely not." And he said, "You get to go to Ranger School jail for the next month." For a month, I walked around Fort Benning picking up trash. And that was a very humbling experience. But it actually was probably the best thing that ever could have happened to me, because it was this collision point of, guess what? You know whose fault it is you're in this position? It's yours. And it's your poor decision making and you not acting like a leader that got you here. So I started reading a lot of leadership books, and I started focusing on how do I, drive back from here. It kind of developed some of the formulas and the things that I now teach on leadership. But that was definitely the defining moment that changed my path.
You have mentioned God before while talking about this topic. I know from listening to some other interviews that you are a Christian. Were you Christian all your life? And if so, did you have a religious epiphany that told you that you were a Christian in name only? Because that's what happened to me when I got diagnosed with ALS. I had to be humbled, and I was.
Yeah, amen to that. So yes, I was raised in a strong Christian family. I mean, we were if the doors were open to the church, we were there. But I would say I was a Christian. Um, I, I was a Christian by blind faith, if that makes sense. I just kind of accepted that I was a Christian because I was raised a Christian. I was raised this way, and I don't think I had ever explored. I just accepted this. And when I got into the military, it's interesting. There's been a dynamic shift in Christianity in probably the last 10 years I've seen, where it's becoming much more accepted in the military, which is a great thing. Um, I felt like when I was growing up in the early 90s, even into the war, we didn't have a lot of Christians or open Christians. Nobody was touting their faith. And I became what I called a closet Christian. I didn't really live like a Christian, that's for sure. Um, when the war started, and in my first combat deployment to Afghanistan, they often say there's no atheists in foxholes. Not that I ever was an atheist. I mean, I still prayed and believed, but I wasn't living a very good Christian life. But I definitely prayed a lot more once we started getting into combat. Fast forward, getting myself in trouble. I don't think I was thinking a lot about God as I went through those moments. Probably a lot more as I drove forward and got myself in trouble, and as I started moving forward past getting in trouble. Um, but I will tell you, the epiphany moment occurred when I was shot, and I lay there. I was bleeding out on the battlefield as this vicious gunfight was occurring, and I remember thinking, "You're going to die. Like, you're going to die here. Like, you're bleeding out." I was losing the ability to move. It was getting harder and harder to breathe. I mean, we go through a lot of trauma training. I knew I was going through all the signs of death. Um, and I remember calling out to God and saying, "Lord, I need your strength. I want to go home and see my wife and kids again." And in that moment, man, I had energy. I went from not being able to move a muscle to just this, I don't know, I can't describe it. It was just this power. And I don't know how long that was. We know that gunfight lasted 40 minutes before we finally brought in the airstrikes and the medevac came in. But when the medevac came in, I had gone from not able to move a muscle to, when my team leader came up, he started to drag me, and it was really painful. And I was like, "Just help me up." And I got up, and I walked to the helicopter under my own power and climbed on the helicopter. So, I mean, really a miracle moment. Um, I, you know, I wish I could say, man, that moment defined everything. And I'm like this rock star Christian and never doubt. I think God made me very analytical. I often ask him, "Why did you make me the way I am?" Faith is such a hard thing. Um, and I often speak in churches about this. But I go back to the Bible and to the New Testament, and so many of the stories in there about the different individuals. The individual who I think it was the Roman centurion that his daughter was sick, and he came to Jesus and he said, "Dear Lord, just heal my daughter." And Jesus said, "Well, if you'll just believe, I'll heal her." And he said, "I do, but help me with my unbelief." And he did. Or you look at Thomas, doubting Thomas, who walked with Jesus as he gave all these miracles, and um, yet still, after Jesus was crucified and came back to life, Thomas still doubted. So I find solace in that. I got big into apologetics. I look into the basis of not only history but science and all these things that help uh, amplify the Bible. So.
Can you, if you're comfortable talking about it, can you set the scene more about that gunfight that you did get injured? I mean, was it just a normal firefight like anything else? Was something off from the beginning?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was normal. I mean, we walked into an ambush, and that's never a good thing. I mean, it's one thing, gunfights. I mean, if you enter a room and we're shooting at each other within a room, as unnormal as that is a little more normal. An ambush situation is you walk into a situation where the enemy has the drop on you and they're delivering overwhelming firepower. It's set up that way. And we had taken down the initial target. No one was there. We saw some activity on another building about 150 yards away. And my team and I moved to that building. We ended up having to go through some really dense vegetation where we thought there were our snipers told us there were individuals hiding in that vegetation. We had an AC-130 gunship up overhead that has pretty advanced targeting and um, equipment that enables us to see things. And they could see some of the enemy. They didn't see all the enemy. So we were following their lead. And long story short, basically maneuvered right into what we call the kill zone. When you have an ambush, everybody's facing a certain way, and there's an area that is the kill zone. Everything's designed to rain as much gunfire and explosives and whatever you can put on that situation. It's limited to the creativity and the execution of the ambushing force. And theirs was pretty good. Multiple machine guns, multiple AK-47 shooters. We don't know how many to this day. We estimate maybe 12 to 15, but we walked right into that. And multiple members of my team were shot, and I was shot uh, 8 times between my body and body armor in that gunfight. So across the body armor, 2 rounds in my left arm, which is, pretty much destroyed my elbow. And I thought it shot my arm off, rounds off my gun, rounds off my side plate, shot my left night vision tube off, rounds off my helmet. And then I turned to try and move back to where our guys were, and I caught a round in the face. It hit me right in front of the ear, traveled through my face, took off my nose, and did some pretty significant damage. I mean, that's kind of a depiction of my skull. That hole was in my helmet, but that's the actual damage to my face that the
Wow.
doctors had to put back together later.
And when you got hit like that, I mean, I'm sure there's probably just an adrenaline dump, but you're in shock. You feel the pain. You hit the ground, and that's the moment where you felt like you couldn't move.
It was a little later. I was initially hit in the arm. So within the first couple of minutes of the firefight, I was hit in the arm, and I didn't realize I'd been shot twice. I just thought I was shot once. And I thought my arm had been shot off. So that was kind of my first focus. I was still trying to shoot and move and get out of this line of fire. Um, so the guy said, so I had kneeled down to shoot, and then I got up and turned to move back to where they were. And that's when I caught the round in the face. And they saw me fall. That knocked me out. To this day, we don't know how long, 5, 10 minutes. And then I came to and thankfully realized I was still alive. So it was sometime during the time I woke up and obviously the end of the gunfight that I was going through that whole thing where I realized I was bleeding out and I called out to God.
Is there any financial compensation for being wounded? You hear stories about people getting hurt fighting for our freedom, and you hope that they get taken care of.
Yes, there is. The Department of Defense definitely takes good care of us. There's an initial, oh my God, I'm forgetting the name of it. There's actually an initial payment they give you based on the level of injuries you sustained, which mine were pretty severe. It took 4 years and 40 surgeries to put me back together. So that money is provided to the family to help with, childcare costs, travel for family. Um, we were traveling back and forth for all these surgeries. So they give that initial, I can't remember the name of it, some type of compensation. If your injuries obviously are so severe, I mean, I am fortunate. They originally talked about amputating my arm, but they were able to save it. But I have very limited range of motion. So this, along with the damage to my face, my vision was not totally corrected. I mean, they had to rebuild my nose. I've got a bunch of nerve and scar issues and all this. So the Department of Defense has ratings. It's kind of crazy. They put a mathematical equation to your injury. So like one of them is facial scarring, and there's a percentage they give you, and that leads up to a disability calculator that they give to veterans. So they have taken good care of me as far as that goes. So I am thankful for that. Obviously, I have moved on from there and tried to create my own path as an entrepreneur and a coach and a speaker and all those things. I think for some guys, it's a great thing. It helps them. Although I worry for other guys, it limits them because instead they just accept that this is all they're ever going to get, and they don't try and move forward and get other things.
When I look at that picture behind you, for the listeners only, the audio only people, they won't see it, but seeing that picture of what the damage was, I mean, holy smokes, it's kind of like a miracle you're alive, isn't it? I mean, what are the odds of that?
It is a miracle. I mean, doctors told me frequently, from the amount of blood I lost, I mean, I needed 8 blood transfusions over 96 hours. They told me that most people that had the level of injuries and the level of blood loss don't survive. So, I mean, I give credit to God for that he saved me and allowed me to come back. Um, and yeah, I'm just, I'm blessed and very grateful, because there aren't a whole lot of people that take a machine gun round to the face and survive. And there's so many God moments that have happened in my life. Everything from Vince Peterson being on the other end of that line when Colonel Chin called. That's such a astronomical God moment, because Vince Peterson was the commanding officer of all East Coast SEAL teams. I mean, he's in charge of hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, probably $500 million in assets, and, the most formidable fighting force on the planet, who was actively engaged in multiple wars at this point. So the chances that guy happened to be at his desk and answer the phone right in that moment. And I asked Colonel Chin, I said, did you pre-stage that call? Did you call him ahead of time and say, I've got one of your guys, let's have a call? And he told me no. He just happened to call him. I mean, I was ready to leave the Navy when I got in trouble. I had resigned myself that I was leaving the Navy, and Vince Peterson saved my career in that moment, and Colonel Chin did. And then later to be wounded. I had one of the best facial reconstruction surgeons in the world put my face back together. He wasn't in the DOD. He was a civilian. But because of some things that happened in my care that I write about in my book, it made me leave and seek out like another doctor, because I had some issues with some of the Navy surgeons. And I found out, like, hey, if the military can't do what you need done, you actually can go to a civilian doctor. And through a amazing path, I ended up with this guy, a guy by the name of Dr. Eduardo Rodriguez. And a lot of people may remember when there was a woman who got her face bit off by a baboon, and they did or maybe a chimpanzee, but either way, and they did a facial transplant, the first successful facial transplant that ever was done. My doctor led that surgery. I mean, that is the caliber of doctor I had. I mean, to sustain this. So yeah, it is a miracle, and I am just really blessed. So God has been involved and has continued to bless me from that moment. Like I said, I wish I often ask God, why did you make me this way? Why did you make me so analytical? Why can't you just give me peace and be like, hey, you're never going to doubt, But I guess that's just not how it works. But I am very grateful for what I have.
What is your mindset at that point? Did you know what you wanted to do? What was your first step? And did you have a mentor or someone you could lean on?
There were a lot of individuals within the wounded community that I met. But I often tell people, another God moment, me failing as a leader set me up for success out of my injuries. Because if I had not been through that experience, that's the hardest experience I ever went through in my life to this date, because I was ostracized from my own community. I had fellow SEALs who were like, get rid of that guy, kick him out. Friends of mine stopped talking to me after that. And that was very difficult. Everything in me wanted to leave. It took, really years to build back my credibility. I was suicidal at one point in Afghanistan. At the very beginning, when it happened in Afghanistan, I put a gun in my mouth and almost took my life. And once again, God stepped in and stopped that. But if I hadn't been through that, I wouldn't have been prepared for my injuries, which, really led to the sign on the door, just making the statement that I'm not going to feel sorry for myself. I'm going to drive forward. And I really never looked back from there. It just kind of became a launch point where I was like, I'm just going to continue to drive forward and get fixed and just figure out what my new 100% is. I can never be the same guy I was before I was wounded, but I'm going to try and be the best 100% version of the new me.
Who or what inspired you to write your first book?
It wasn't intentional to write a book. I'll be honest. So I was trached, and Tim, I can super empathize. I was trached for 7 months and 2 days. So I wasn't able to talk. So I could only communicate by writing. So obviously, combat warriors want to know about combat. So all my teammates and everybody that came to visit me wanted to know about the firefight. So, it started with me writing all about, the mission, the planning, how it happened, how it unfolded. There were holes in my story because, little did I know I was unconscious during those times. I found that out later. And my teammates helped fill those in. And then I started writing about other missions we had done because, people would come in and visit. And then it just became something I started to do. I mean, 4 years, 40 surgeries. After a surgery, I would frequently, I'd have to travel. I had surgeries in Baltimore. I had surgeries up in Chicago. And I would have to travel up there, and frequently it'd be at a minimum a week, if not a 2-week recovery before I'd be able to go home for, the post-op checks and all that. So I just started writing after surgery. I would write about, missions we had done and things like that. And I started writing about the mistakes I made in Afghanistan and the leadership challenges and going through Ranger School. And by the time I was done, it was almost 200 pages. And,
Wow.
and this is probably 3 years later now from my injuries. And I was assigned to a new SEAL team. And I'd had some friends that read it and they said, hey, man, this is really good. And books in the SEAL teams are kind of a double-edged sword. We're much more public than we were in the past. And there's an old school mindset of you never talk about what we do, period. And so I was kind of worried because here I was, this guy who got himself in trouble before, and I didn't want to damage my reputation again by being that guy. So I took it to one of our very respected command master chiefs, And he had been my master chief in Afghanistan, and now he's with the master chief at our this command, the development group. And I gave him, the 200 pages that I had written, and I said, "Hey, I have some friends who feel like this is good. What do you think?" And he read it and he said, "Jay, I think it's really good. It's very humble. You own it. You're not talking about things you shouldn't be talking about." And he said, "Let's share it with the commanding officer." My commanding officer said, "Hey, let's send it up to the SEAL headquarters." And then at that point, it was kind of like, "Hey, we're giving you the green light." I reached out to Marcus Luttrell. Marcus connected me to his agent, and that's how, from that point, it turned into a book.
Jason, this is a totally selfish question that I didn't think I'd be asking you, but I've always wanted to know this, and there's not a lot of people that have been intubated, especially for that long. What was that like? I mean, I know for my dad, losing the ability to naturally speak, as having used the device, it's extremely challenging. I can't even imagine what that's like. But you've been on both sides. I mean, how difficult was that, and what was the feeling like when you got your voice back?
Amazing, and also scary. I won't lie. One, I am so empathetic to anyone with a trach. Their mucus builds up. They have to be cleaned regularly, and it's a strange feeling to have that. It also, when they finally removed it, I had become accustomed to breathing this way. So you have to think, the top of your lungs is right here, and you're breathing out of this hole, this stoma. Well, the air now traveling all the way up through your nasal passages, which mine now had been reconstructed. There was a lot of resistance. So I remember the first time, initially they capped it. They didn't remove it totally for the first couple of months. And I remember it was scary. Like, I was like, I can't breathe. And I had to build up over several days getting used to breathing normally again. But I'm so empathetic to anybody that has a trach, Tim. My hat's off to you. Much respect.
Can you also tell us about your new book that's about to come out?
Yeah, I'm really excited. The new book is called Mission Invincible Marriage. It comes out in March. And in my first book, The Trident, I told the whole story of meeting my wife and our journey through the SEAL teams, through my injuries, which made a lot of people just love my wife, as they should. She's incredible. And she has helped me through so many of the hard times in my life. I mean, when I failed as a leader, obviously, when I was injured, I got involved in a business lawsuit that was just brutal. I got wrongfully accused of things we didn't do and got cleared of it, but it was brutal. And she was there with me. And then I got super sick in 2021. So all these things are things that we went through together. Um, so the SEAL teams have a 90% divorce rate. Wounded warriors have a 90% divorce rate. So over the years, so many people have said, "How have you done this? How have you guys stayed married?" And we finally sat down and wrote down all the things. I mean, we had never. I mean, some things we definitely had been very deliberate about in the way we approached our marriage, but other things were things we just did. And we finally kind of wrote it all down, and it became the format for this book. And we submitted it to HarperCollins, the same publishing house who had done the Trident, and they said, "We love it." So I hope it will help other military. I hope it'll help anybody in a marriage or who's getting ready to go into a marriage. But I won't lie, it is written the most for our protectors, military, law enforcement, and fire, individuals who have a very dangerous or a very traumatic job. It would work great for medical professionals, high level medical professionals, also very stress filled jobs. But how you approach your marriage, how you approach your relationship, how you communicate, how you establish and lay your values, how you deal with adversity, all these things we write about in the book. So, yeah, super excited. It'll come out in March.
We'll put a link to it in the show notes for everybody.
Jason, we haven't spoken about a very important facet of your life, and that's your kids. What can you tell us about them, and are they likely to enter the military?
No, I'm super blessed. And, my kids, Tim, as you well know, man, your kids show you what unconditional love is. You and I have gone through different challenges. I mean, I was in bed. I was in a wheelchair for a while, but thankfully God blessed me to get, to my new 100%. And I know you going through what you've been through. I'm sure there are mental struggles that came with that. But the interesting thing, our kids love us no matter what. And my kids taught me what unconditional love is. My youngest daughter, um, I was never around her whole life as a baby. I mean, up until she was 3, and then I come home severely wounded, and she didn't know me. I remember one time I came home from a trip before I was wounded, and I got home and I tried to pick her up, and she screamed, not wanting me to hold her because she didn't know me. I was some stranger. And that was heartbreaking. So fast forward to my injury, here I was, my middle daughter was now 5. She was in kindergarten. My son was in second grade. So they were at school. So during the day, I'm recovering in bed. And my daughter would just come up and climb into bed and snuggle with me. And that was, um, there was so much healing in that, um, to have someone there who just loved you unconditionally. Because I won't lie, I mean, here I am in the beginning, my face is totally blown out. I'm trach, they're feeding me through a stomach tube. I had all this metal hardware coming out of my arm. And to have both my wife, but really, my daughter and my kids. So my kids are amazing. They have grown up to be incredible young adults. I mean, my son is 25. My oldest daughter got married. She's 22. I've got a great new son-in-law, and my youngest is 20. And I'm just fortunate. I think it's a combination of my wife and I who have been able to raise really successful kids. They're involved in our business now, and I love my family is the most important thing in my life. I don't I've been very successful in my life. I'm an award-winning author and an amazing speaker and an entrepreneur now. But I don't care about any of that stuff. That all could go away. If I can just be with my family, that's the most important thing to me.
It's like my dad's whole ethos.
Well, I respect it and appreciate it.
Now, on to our final word segment where we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
You know, maybe the moment I realized I was still alive when I came to out of this first surgery, because I didn't think I was going to make it. I really thought I was going to die that night. And I remember coming out of the surgery, and it's kind of funny. I was high as a kite because I was on all these drugs, these pain meds, and I was just like dumbfounded, like, oh my god, I'm still alive. And to know that I was going to go home and see my wife and kids again, that was an amazing moment. And I mean, there's so many more, but that's probably I don't know if that's my first thought.
What is the biggest adversity you've faced?
It was my failure as a leader and overcoming myself, but having to earn back the respect and credibility of my teammates.
What are you most excited about?
Continuing to grow, grow as an entrepreneur. I've got a lot of amazing things happening. I'm involved in this pretty big speaking competition that is, I'm in the finals for that, which is kind of exciting. We've got the new book coming out. We are working on a screenplay for the Trident. That would be amazing if that could obviously move forward. Very tough. I'm growing as an entrepreneur. I mean, I probably have some other books I'd like to write someday. So I'm just thankful. There's a lot of opportunity, and God has blessed us, and I'm just very thankful. So a lot out there on the horizon that we're continuing, and it's nice because I'm doing all of it with my family.
Next one. What advice would you give your younger self?
grow up faster, be a leader faster. Um, I wanted to, I was disciplined enough to be successful, but I was immature when I made the transition to be a leader. And I would tell myself, be the absolute best version. You need to be the best version of yourself all the time, as a leader. And you need to try and be, the best SEAL, the best Jason Redman. And I didn't do that. I was probably like a 75% at that point. You pick and choose the times you want to let your hair down, and you can't live at 100% all the time. You'll burn out. But I was definitely not there, and I would tell myself, you're going to end up creating a lot of problems for yourself if you don't grow up quicker, because I did.
This one should be it's a good plug for the book. Do you have any book recommendations for the listeners or for us?
Yes, the number one book I will recommend is not my book. It's actually Fearless, by Eric Blem, and it is about Adam Brown, a teammate of mine who was killed March 17th, 2010. I have an amazing story, resiliency and overcoming. I think Adam's may be better than mine, but the story is incredible. They have been trying to make it into a movie. They keep running into challenges. Adam was an amazing Christian on top of all that. So that's number one. Number two would be The Trident. My book that is, it's a leadership and it's a redemption story. A young kid who messed up and grew up. And I hope the message it sends to so many young men, I mean, it applies to anybody, but I think young men were guilty of this. Ego and arrogance are dangerous things. When you mess up, it's never too late, man. I am the ultimate redemption. God, not only on the Christian side, but God saved my career and allowed me to come back and have great success. So, and then hopefully the marriage book. I've had a lot of friends that have read it and said it's going to be your most successful book. So hopefully Mission Invincible Marriage. I know there's a lot of guys that are like, I'm not going to read something like that. But I will tell you, it's written from a military perspective. So I give military examples like, I give examples like, you should have rules of engagement and how you fight, no different in the military. When you fight with your spouse, there should be rules of engagement. You will fight. That is just, that's part of being, that's part of couples. Friends fight, couples will fight, but you should have rules. And we apply it from a military perspective, which I think is a lot of people really enjoyed that. So if
anyone's going to get guys reading about marriage, I think it's you.
I hope so, man. I hope so. Because marriage is on the decline in America. We're at a 50% divorce rate now. And there's so many young people that are going into a marriage with this idea of, hey, let's get married. But if it doesn't work out, no big deal. And marriage should be for life. So we give parameters on, maybe if your values aren't aligned, maybe you shouldn't be getting married, because it's going to create problems later down the road. Maybe they're not the right person for you. And then if they are and you're committed, then we give you the tools and the structure on how you, continue to strengthen your relationship, how you communicate, and obviously how you deal with adversity. So, guys, I hope you'll read the book. Both my wife and I wrote it together. So it's written from both our perspectives, which I think is very unique. I don't think you've had too many special operations wives who, have given that perspective.
Last one. The name of this podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything else that you want to say?
I'll say two things, man. Praise the Lord. I am blessed. So much that has happened to me there's no doubt God has enabled it. That being said, I meet people who believe sometimes like I prayed and God didn't help me, or I'm in this bad situation, or this or that. I also believe in the power of self-leadership. And I believe that God helps you, but sometimes he looks to you and he's like, it's on you to get up and drive through this. I think there's so many examples of that where I meet people who are waiting for some sort of miracle, when the reality is they just need to get up and start driving forward. So it's those two things. God has done so many amazing things for me, but he also enabled me to have some great resilience and drive that I utilized to drive forward past some major points of adversity.
Awesome. Jason, before we go, I ask this at the end of every podcast. Who are a couple of people that you know personally? And this is how we got to talk to you through Chris Nowitzki. Who are a couple of people you know personally that you think we should try to get on the podcast?
Have you had Chad Robichaud on?
No.
Chad would be amazing. Super strong Christian, runs an organization called Mighty Oaks Foundation. He was a Marine and has done some incredible things, including going back to Afghanistan to save he helped with the fall, save people from the fall of Afghanistan, but on his own went back and saved his own interpreter who he owed his life to. They're actually making a movie about this called Saving Aziz. So Chad's an incredible guy and a friend. I would highly recommend him.
Jason Redman, it has been a privilege to talk with you. Thank you so much for your service and your time today. As you said, it's always great to meet other overcomers. May God continue to bless you and your family.
Tim, likewise, man. I mean, I was just reading your bio. I'm inspired. How many people have something terrible happen and they just, they stop living? One of the things I speak on is continuing to live greatly if you still have a pulse, man. And you are a shining example of that. So.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for your service too. I should have said that earlier.
Yeah, my honor. So.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider supporting the podcast for free by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. This episode of Nothing Left Unsaid is brought to you by 11 Labs. Their groundbreaking technology makes a huge difference, and we're grateful for their support. To learn more, visit 11labs.io. A substantial portion of our sponsorship proceeds go to tackleals.com, funding cutting-edge ALS research. If you'd like to join the fight and contribute, visit tackleals.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Nothing Left Unsaid.